Hi guys, it's Marc Zicree, Mr. Sci-Fi, also known as Marc Zicree of Space Command, and today I'm going to tell you a fascinating story about Paramount suing a Star Trek project called Axanar and what I think should and shouldn't be done and the history of how this has come to pass because it's fascinating. So, to use a word that a Vulcan of our acquaintance has often used. So basically, here's some of the background. Science fiction has been unique in one way, or at least it has a proud history of something that a lot of other areas of literature didn't have, by and large, which is something called fan fiction. There's always been a very porous relationship between the creators of science fiction and the fans, the readers and viewers of all these different universes. Because unlike a story like, let's say, David Copperfield, where someone says, well, gosh, I like that David Copperfield novel, and I wish there were sequels. I think I'll sit down and write me some sequels of David Copperfield. It doesn't happen very often. You don't go to David Copperfield conventions, and although there are Dickens conventions, people can dress up as the Dickens characters. It's not the same thing, because science fiction creates a universe, a speculative universe, and whether it's Star Wars or Star Trek or any of these other wonderful worlds that science fiction creates, people enter into them and fantasize about being in those worlds. And it was only natural that fans, going back to, the beginning of science fiction, would want to write their own stories and create their own tales, spinning out more adventures of their favorite science fiction characters, and sometimes even creating their own characters to go into those universes. And in the early days, for instance, my friend Ray Bradbury, the first thing he ever wrote was he was a huge fan of Edgar Rice Burroughs' Mars novels, Princess of Mars, John Carter of Mars, all of that stuff, and he didn't want to wait for the next one to come out. And so when he was 12 years old, he sat down with a toy typewriter his family had given him and wrote a novel, a sequel to Edgar Rice Burroughs' Mars stories. And that set him on his path of creating his own wonderful, wonderful pieces of work. So originally, science fiction fans would write these stories, and in some cases they would mimeograph them before there was Xerox or computer printers or any of that, and share them amongst themselves. And that was fine. They weren't getting sued. They weren't selling their work. It was all just for the fun of it. Then, of course, in recent decades, film and videotape and all of that emerged, and so the fans started shooting their own Star Trek, Star Wars adventures. And even it's funny because when I was a kid, I even started shooting my own Super 8 Star Trek film when I was, I don't know, maybe 11, 12 years old. And I never finished that, but I actually wrote the script and started making the costumes and props and all of that. And in fact, when the original Star Trek ended, not long after, there was actually a fan film with George Takei that I believe was shot on Super 8, and it was never completed. I've seen shots from it, but I think there's some fans trying to finish that one now, do the audio track and so forth, because it was shot what's called MOS, which is without sound. But more recently, what started happening was Star Wars fans started shooting their own very highly polished productions, and Star Trek fans started shooting their own very highly polished productions. Now, the reaction initially of those two franchises was very, very different. In terms of Star Wars, George Lucas embraced those ventures, and in fact had an annual contest where the best fan films would win. He would bestow the prize, and that's continuing now. J.J. Abrams announced the new contest, and one can even think of Force Awakens as the ultimate Star Wars fan film because J.J. is such a huge fan of Star Wars. Initially, however, Paramount had a very, very different reaction. Now, I'd heard that they had been very proprietary about their copyright, to the degree that initially they would go to conventions and tell fans who were dressed in Star Trek costumes that they were in violation of copyright if they were wearing homemade costumes, which of course pissed everyone off. And but when Enterprise came out and it was not well received, they decided that they'd better not kill the golden goose, and they better embrace fan films of Star Trek. And there was a fellow named James Cawley who, together with other fans, built replicas of all the Star Trek sets, the original Star Trek sets in upstate New York, started shooting his own Star Trek fan films with Doug Drexler doing the visual effects, other people. Doug was the effects guy on Deep Space Nine and Star Trek Voyager and Enterprise and so forth. And he started getting actors who had been in the original Star Trek to appear in them. William Wyndham, Malachi Throne, Barbara Luna. These were wonderful actors. And then he started getting the lead actors from Star Trek, like Walter Koenig. And it was very impressive, and the effects were terrific, the costumes were terrific, the sets were terrific, and it was called Star Trek New Voyages. And Paramount looked the other way, because this is before crowdfunding, and no one was getting rich. They were self-funding, and I, in fact, reached out to George Takei, and along with my friend Michael Reeves, who, along with me, was a writer on Star Trek The Next Generation, and many other shows. I co-wrote a script with Michael, I directed it, and Elaine and I executive produced it. And again, it was by and large self-funded. We weren't reaching out to the public to say, finance this. And it got nominated for the Hugo and Nebula. It was as good as anything I ever did for the networks. And you can actually go to marczicree.com and watch it. It was nominated for the Hugo and Nebula. I'm very, very proud of it. It was called World Enough in Time. And then Star Trek New Voyages became Star Trek Phase 2. Naming itself after a Star Trek series that never got made that Paramount was going to launch in the 70s. And there were other offshoots. There's Star Trek Continues, which again is continuing the original episodes, as if the series hadn't been canceled. The original Star Trek, Vic Mignogna is doing that along with other very talented people. It's a lot of fun. If you go online, you can watch these episodes. But what started to happen was crowdfunding emerged. And some of these projects started to launch crowdfunding campaigns. Star Trek Renegades is another one that stars Walter Koenig, and increasingly they were actually featuring actors who had been guest stars and even leads on some of the various Star Trek series. So you started to get, the actor who played Tuvok, and you started to get, on and on. I mean, and from actors from other franchises as well, Battlestar Galactica, etc. So. And many of these were very entertaining. Some of them might not be at the level of a professional studio or network show, but they were fun and they were free. You could basically go online and watch them. Now, something I should mention again, the lines started to blur, and when Michael Reeves and I wrote World Enough in Time, we came, and I'd always wanted to see a star. Since it was Captain Sulu, I'd always wanted to see a Captain Sulu TV show, and CBS/Paramount, they're now owned by Viacom. They never came up with one, and George Takei is a terrific actor. So back in 2007, 2008, when we did World Enough in Time, Michael Reeves and I, along with our friend Winston Engel, we came up with the pilot for a Captain Sulu show, and we outlined a 2-hour pilot, and we wrote a series Bible, and I met with CBS, and I actually pitched it, and it was very clear to me. When I met with them, it was a very nice executive, but it was very, very clear that they were just interested to see what our take would be, but they had no interest in ever doing a Captain Sulu TV show, which is very unfortunate because it would have been wonderful, and George Takei is wonderful, and we'll never see that show. And so that, but and the possibility of mounting my own project and reaching out directly to my audience because of that experience with Star Trek, World Enough in Time. That led directly to Space Command, which is the project I'm doing now, which is original, and I own it, and I don't have to worry about Paramount or CBS breathing down my neck. But then what happened was a fellow named Alec Peters, who ran an auction house called PropWorks that auctions off Star Trek memorabilia. I met him, and he had an idea for something called Axanar, and it was a fascinating idea because, again, a lot of these Star Trek fan films would often use some of the minutiae of Star Trek or a lesser-known episode as launching points, and then they would spin out their own original stories. And often, by the way, these were being written by writers who had worked on Star Trek. They were either the TV shows such as Dorothy Fontana, DC Fontana wrote some of these where she was a story editor and a writer on the original Star Trek, or David Gerrold wrote and directed a Star Trek New Voyages episode, and he of course had written Trouble with Tribbles and been on Star Trek The Next Generation. So Alec Peters' idea was there was a lesser-known Star Trek episode, original series, called Whom Gods Destroy. And it was set in an insane asylum. There are 2 Star Trek episodes set in insane asylums, And in this one, and the best part of the episode is Yvonne Craig, who played Batgirl, was painted green, and she looked great, Orion slave girl. And but the basic plot was that Garth of Axanar, Garth was a starship captain, Federation starship captain. He was a hero of the Battle of Axanar. He was Kirk's idol, the man that Kirk patterned himself after. But in the interim, in the intervening years, he'd gone crazy, and now he's in an insane asylum, and he's taken over the insane asylum, and hijinks ensue. But Alec Peters' notion initially was to do a full-length Star Trek film that could be essentially a backdoor pilot, and it would be about Garth and about the Battle of Axanar. And his idea was to star in it as Garth himself, and co-write it and produce it, and so forth. And he recruited a lot of actors from Star Trek and Battlestar Galactica, and he launched a crowdfunding campaign. He basically reached out to Tobias Richter, who was a very good visual effects artist who's done Star Trek stuff, and so he did an initial crowdfunding campaign that raised $100,000, $200,000, and he then shot something called Prelude to Axanar, which I believe you can see online, and it was a 20-minute prelude to the 2-hour film he envisioned. And it was basically the characters from the Battle of Axanar, including Klingons and Vulcans, talking about the battle, and then special effects footage of the battle itself. And it was very impressive. And Alec rented a theater during Comic-Con, San Diego Comic-Con, and he showed it to the fans to launch a crowdfunding campaign. And subsequently, he's had several crowdfunding campaigns around Axanar, and he also shot an opening scene, or a walk and talk scene with a Vulcan from the movie. Again, very impressive visual effects. And with that, he had several crowdfunding campaigns, and he was able to raise around $1.5 million. Well, that's real money. That's, walking around money. And with that money, he was able to open a studio, start building sets. He hired John Accavelli, who had designed the sets for Babylon 5, to build his sets. I was just at his studio the other day. The sets are great. The studio is great. And his plan was to start shooting the movie. So that's when Paramount stepped in and sued him. They hired a lawsuit called Loeb & Loeb, a very high-end firm, and they sued him, claiming that, of course, Paramount owns Star Trek. Paramount basically is overseeing the Star Trek movies. CBS, their sister company, is overseeing the new TV show. Now, of course, in the interim, JJ's been doing the Star Trek movies. The third one is about to come out, directed by the director of Fast and Furious, and co-written by Simon Pegg, who plays Scotty in the new Star Trek movies, and CBS announced a new Star Trek show. And the Star Trek show is, Roberto Orci is overseeing it, along with Brian Fuller, who wrote for Deep Space Nine and the Star Trek franchise, and also Nicholas Meyer has just been brought aboard, the director of The Wrath of Khan, and he also was a writer on I think Star Trek 6, and I think he directed that as well. So terrifically talented people. And CBS is intending to launch a new digital network. There'll be subscription where Star Trek will be the flagship, and you'll have to pay like $9 a month to watch it. And there's precedent, because Paramount launched UPN, and had one of the Star Trek shows. I think it was Star Trek Voyager as the flagship of that network. And in the 70s, when they were developing Star Trek Phase 2, they were going to use that to launch a Paramount network back in the 70s. But after a year of development, instead Star Wars came out, and they decided to make the Star Trek movies instead, which of course brought them a lot of money. And Star Trek is one of their cash cows. Star Trek, along with Mission Impossible, is one of the few franchises that Paramount owns. So they're really looking to maximize it. So they slapped Alec with a lawsuit. Now, I personally think this is a mistake, because another thing that I didn't mention was that when I did Star Trek World Enough in Time, I reached out to CBS and Paramount to see if they wanted to sell it. Because for me, it seemed like a no-brainer that if they wanted to, sell fan films as downloadable content, the fans are self-financing, so there's no financial risk for Paramount or CBS. There's only an upside, which is that they could generate millions of dollars by efficiently licensing it and selling it. And interestingly enough, CBS Video wanted to acquire World Enough in Time. There were executives who were very excited about that, but the guy at the top wasn't a science fiction fan. And he was what people in the executive hierarchy call a turtle, which is he just keeps his head in, he never makes a risky decision, and he's just waiting to get his pension. And so he vetoed it, because he just didn't get it, and he didn't want to take a risk and do anything new. And there was also an executive at Paramount who wanted to license and sell world enough in time under the Paramount video on demand, downloadable content. And again, they just couldn't get the person at the top of the hierarchy to say yes. But there was executive interest. So Alec Peters, with Axanar, his hope, of course, would be, that CBS/Paramount would embrace it, and before the new Star Trek series was announced, the thought was, well, maybe this would be a new Star Trek show, Axanar. But no, that's not the way they think in business affairs. So now there's a lawsuit, and we'll see how that shakes out and what happens. Alec Peters is a lawyer, so that makes things interesting. And and there's a law firm that's involved on his side too. I understand. So, but ultimately, it's a shame because, it's interesting because Amazon recently licensed certain franchises and allowed fan fiction to be sold on Amazon. This is written fan fiction, and one of the franchises was Pretty Little Liars. And my friend Joe Dougherty, who's executive producer on Pretty Little Liars, is actually writing some of these stories. And again, what this is all about is the blurring line between fan fiction and professional fiction. Because if, for instance, with these Star Trek films, if the writers and directors and actors and visual effects people who've worked on Star Trek are working on those, what's canon and what's not? What's official and what's not? One can say, well, clearly CBS and Paramount own Star Trek, they own the copyright. That's accurate. But with Pretty Little Liars, they licensed it and people can write fan fiction, and Joe Dougherty, who's writing the show, is also writing these stories. And so who is harmed in this? No one is harmed in this. Money is generated, fans are happy. It's understood that fan fiction, quote unquote, is not canon, just like the Star Trek novels are not canon. The Star Wars novels, until recently have not been canon. Canon means they're part of the official true story. Like when I was a kid, the Superman comics would have imaginary stories where, Superman gets married and has kids, and I was saying to myself, well, they're all imaginary stories, aren't there? None of it's real. But these would be stories that we said, okay, we step outside of the official timeline, the official version of the story to create alternatives that can be interesting. So in my opinion, what Paramount should be doing, what CBS should be doing, if they're not going to embrace it and make it as an official series, if they licensed it, they could sell it, the fans would be happy, they'd be happy, everyone wins. Whereas with a lawsuit, it spreads bad feeling. It's just and it also costs enormous amounts of money for Paramount and for everyone. And you can say, well, yes, this is protecting their copyright. Well, it's true. That's true. But meantime, George Lucas and Lucasfilm are doing Star Wars fan films and embracing them and, encouraging those filmmakers, and people are getting to learn filmmaking and people are getting to play the roles that they fantasize about. And it's just fun for everyone. It's embracing. It's all embracing. And I think that's a much healthier attitude. And the other thing I said to Alec Peters is if Paramount is determined to enforce their copyright, the other alternative is to just strip out all the Star Trek elements and shoot the script, change the name, shoot the script as a science fiction film, because clearly Paramount doesn't own the copyright to the notion of space travel or spaceships or space battles. Otherwise they would have sued Star Wars when it came out, and clearly that wouldn't work because there's a decades-long history of space opera and space adventure and so forth. So, and I also said to him, another alternative would be, because there's so many so many science fiction novelists are in favor of Axanar, you could also look at science fiction novelists who have pre-existing universes, space-going universes, and just utilize their existing universes and have it be, Joe Haldeman's blah, 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 whatever. And I'm just using Joe as an example, as a name out of a hat. So, but ongoingly, I think, we'll see how this shakes out. If Paramount wins, if Axanar is forced to not, well, the worst case of all, of course, because I think that if Axanar had to change the names and be not Star Trek, but completed the story, shot it with the same actors who've come aboard from Battlestar Galactica, etc., Star Trek, I don't think the fans would be pissed off at Axanar, because they would understand that Paramount stepped in and it was out of their control, and they still get a film that's entertaining. The worst case scenario would be if $1.5 million was raised and nothing gets made, and the money is just burned up by, the attrition of a lawsuit. So I hope that that's not what happens, and I don't think it will be. But meantime, I think it's very interesting to see these different attitudes, because in my opinion, science fiction has always been embracing the audience. It's whether it's Star Trek conventions, whether it's fan fiction, whether it's any of the wonderful things that science fiction allows the audience to dream and to be part of. It's always been welcoming. It's always been something that said, you're part of this world too. We're all part of it together. In many cases, the fans become the professionals. Ray Bradbury, Heinlein, all of these guys started as science fiction fans and then became professionals. And I think a number of the people making fan films ultimately graduate to the professional ranks if they aren't already in them. So, and even if they don't, even if it's just something that someone does for fun, I think there's a lot to be said for fun. And I think it's not something to be treated lightly, because dreams and living a full life and being able to fully express oneself and share it with others is part of the creative impulse, and it makes all of our lives better. So anyway, so that's a little bit of my thoughts. And again, I'm not at all saying people don't have a right to copyright and people don't have a right to earn from the things they themselves have created. So it's just that this is a very special circumstance, and I think one that if people just stepped back and took a breath and were sensible, we'd get a very different outcome. So that's it for now. Marc Zicree, Mr. Sci-Fi, Marc Zicree of Space Command. Feel free to spread the word about Mr. Sci-Fi and put out the word, tweet, like, do all the things you do. We're here on YouTube, Facebook, all sorts of platforms. And if you're interested in Space Command, I'll be doing a Mr. Sci-Fi video on what the hell is Space Command, for those of you who don't know. And it's a big, epic science fiction project I'm doing. So until next time, thanks very much. Marc Zicree, Mr. Sci-Fi. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.